Okay, welcome everybody to our presentation today here in our third session with Dr. Ashley Hamilton Kahn. We're going to be talking all about disrupting whiteness, faculty perceptions at Hispanic serving institutions. Dr. Hamilton Kahn holds a PhD in higher education and an MA degrees in education and in English. With over a decade of experience in teaching communication courses at Cal State LA, Azusa Pacific, and the University of La Verne, she specializes in inclusive, student-centered pedagogy. We love that here at Westcliff. Dr. Kahn's teaching blends mastery learning, active engagement, and technology integration to support diverse learners in both in-person and hybrid environments. Let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Hamilton Kahn. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. It's really nice and it's an honor to be able to gather here with you guys today and have some of these important conversations. Yeah, so I did a study that it's on disrupting whiteness, focusing on faculty's perspectives, and of course, HSIs, I'll refer to it as that, Hispanic serving institutions, for anyone who may not be familiar. So the research objective that I set in was to examine how faculty racial composition and their perception shape the learning environment at Hispanic serving institutions. So in terms of like what I looked at, who are the faculty, how they think their role, how do they perceive their role, their students, because all of that affects the climate, the pedagogy, the institutional norms. And when we talk about like the campus culture, this is a large part of what actually shapes that culture, and has like within this research, I'll get into that, but there's a gap within the landscape of higher ed in looking at that. And so my goal was to analyze how unexamined norms of whiteness influence both faculty practice and the lived experiences of Latinx students. And I'll refer to as Latinx from here on out, gender neutral term for people of Latin American descent, to be inclusive to non-binary and gender diverse folks. And so the goal was to look beyond the explicit acts of what people think of when you think of discrimination, and to focus on the tacit structures of whiteness, that inform those white norms, right? What is considered student readiness? What is considered good teaching? And analyze and disrupt what those actually mean and how they fit into the idea of actually serving students at these institutions. Last thing on this, the objectives are interconnected. Faculty perceptions and racial composition shape each other, as who is in the room defines what becomes normalized and examined, right? So, a little bit of context and rationale for this study. Within the existing research, there is a lot of quantitative studies looking at the quantitative outcomes, which is very important, but is incomplete in itself and was a gap that I found, right? And so when we talk about those quantitative outcomes, we're thinking enrollment numbers, graduation rates, persistence, success metrics, but there's a gap in faculty perspectives on the actual mission of HSIs and how faculty see Latinx students and what they believe that they're as faculty. What is your role working at an HSI? Few of the studies that exist in the landscape probed how unexamined norms of whiteness shape the curriculum, pedagogy, definitions of like what counts as knowledge here in this classroom at the university level and as faculty roles. So that drove these research questions. I entered in with the inquiry of primary research question: how do faculty perceptions and racial composition shape the learning environment for Latinx students at Hispanic serving institutions? Followed by these sub questions: how do faculty interpret the mission and purpose? How do Latinx students experience the learning environment and what supports or hinders them? how do unexamined norms of whiteness influence faculty and institutional practices? So let me let me get a little water before I get into this. In terms of the methodology, hermeneutics phenomenology. I selected this qualitative methodology because it focuses on experience and interpretation, which were very important frameworks, right? Because I'm looking at how faculty perceive and interpret their learning environment. What do they say about it? How do they reflect on it? And almost most importantly, like what is inferred or what's unspoken? What are those silences? The data collection involves semi-structured interviews with white and non-white faculty at several HSIs, focused on how the dominant culture shapes perceptions of the learning environment. And so all the questions were open-ended, inviting stories and reflection, really encouraged like their narrative. I made the most out of like pauses, didn't intervene. That was an important part of it. Making of those unfinished, a lot of hesitations. I don't want to say the wrong thing, or, well, um, and and like more explicit ones too that I'll get into. But these moments often hold like where norms were felt, not named. Because in real life, we're not like, oh, well, the white activity in colloquial conversations usually. And so one of my goals was to disarm performative allyship, right? To elicit more genuine reflections on power, identity, and whiteness, to see like how do those shape the environment? Because for the most part, you're dealing with faculty. They know the right thing to say, right? Sometimes not, but I want to dig deeper in that and actually get a feel for what's going on underneath. And so, my analysis followed phenomenological procedures. Um, sorry, reading transcripts multiple times, coding meaning for units, identifying themes. I'll go over the four main ones: interpreting in light of theory. I chose whiteness studies. Those were different ones I was in between. Um, there's four different themes that I found. Let me go over those and then look at the implications. So the theme A, I labeled deficit mindset. And so many faculty explain student struggles in terms of what students lacked: tools, backgrounds, certain skills, cultural capital, like came out in, well, because of like their background, right? So, a particular example that really captured was someone who said, growing up in a disadvantaged environment, students are just kind of progressing without going past a certain level. They don't have the tools. Also, it's my job to fix and fill the gaps that a lot of disadvantaged students lack. And what they're prompted was is like, so this is a Hispanic Survey Institution. Like, do you see that? Like, do you know that? What does it mean to you? And like, tell me about your students, right? Like, so very open-ended question. They're not being asked of like, tell me about your students that are obviously lacking from their background, right? It's like, you work at this institution. What does that mean? Like, tell me about your students coming in, right? And so framing students as passive recipients who must be fixed, right? Rather than starting just assuming like their cultural wealth, starting from their strengths, viewing them as funds of knowledge, or assuming institutional structures create and perpetuate barriers, right? So it's not necessarily that they started with the problem, but it's that the problem was the students, right? Not this, and it was an assumption that it was the students. It was almost an unspoken rather than just assuming like, well, obviously because of the white structure that institutions still exist in, and so this mindset has consequences, such as shaping teaching practices, remedial, more policing of grammar, student deficiencies, and definitely I felt contribute to stereotype threat, internalized feelings of insufficiency among them. Um, let me see. Theme B, maintaining power. This was a prominent one. So some faculty expressed that responsibilities around DEI or serving students is real, but accountability felt vague for them. Faculty describe restorative approaches for diversity violations instead of clear consequences, while expecting faculty to solve problems individually despite systemic barriers, right? So any acknowledgement of that, it's like, well, that's my problem in the classroom, right? That's my responsibility. And not that it's not, but there wasn't any like speaking or assumption that their structure is the problem or should be changed or like that's the focus, right? There was a consensus among faculty that the burden of addressing inequities falls on them individually, right? With pressure to fix the Latinx student, that despite limited resources, institutional support, or structural change, right? And so they recognized that like, or they didn't necessarily recognize that they had this pressure to fix. They're describing that to me, but they recognize the institution's pressure on them to fix these students. And so obviously this underscores the need for both the individual as well as collective institutional strategies, right? It's not just like on the ground level. In terms of the C, is perceptions, faculties, the theme of like they don't have was a phrase that was frequently came up. The theme C was complacency. And so some faculty express resignation about structural inequities or believe certain barriers are just kind of like, what are you going to do? Right. And that came out as being a minority is an automatic barrier. And the inference was like race, ethnicity. And one specifically said, I'm not sure addressing it, they're talking about microaggressions, will make a tangible difference. It is a conundrum that would still exist despite best efforts, because then you'd have to look at socioeconomics, gender, sexuality, other identity marks. Um, there's a lot there, which I'll move on to the last one to make use of the time well. But that talking about this particular faculty had gotten in trouble for a microaggression and had consequences, right? That they were dealing with that personally, and that was their response, right? Like we could do this, but these things are kind of inevitable and almost like, what are you going to look at? Like every single identity marker, which is where the methodology comes in, because there's a lot of inferences and interpretation and assumptions that go into that. Um, sorry. And then theme D, the white savior narrative. This was a strong thread through all of them. I would say faculty often position themselves as the one who must fix, empower, uplift students who are lacking, right? These are actual words used. For example, we're going to make sure something they would tell students that they're proud of, you know, they would say, we're going to make sure that you have perfect grammar before we move you to college writing, so you can succeed. Someone who taught a stretch course, remediation course, or without somebody pointing out the expectations, they may not reach the level that they're capable of, right? And so in there's like this inference of like white normativity. Their norm exists outside of it. I am within it, within the institution. And like I'm needed to show them. Students are framed as needing correction. What this is what they should know. This is what's acceptable. Faculty explicitly or implicitly assume that Latinx students don't already hold valuable knowledge, or that faculty must bring them up to a standard defined outside of their culture, right? And then these narratives reflected whiteness not just an overt power, but as the background norm, right? You see overt power in a lot of those statements, but as the overt norm. Um, I think I'm running up on time, so let me get to the practical theoretical implications of this. So first, that faculty perception significantly shaped the learning environment. That was very clear from the beginning, but as you know, saturation, that became a solid implication that even when faculty intended to be supportive, and I would say all of the faculty were extremely supportive, like intending their beliefs about what students lacked, about what counts as being prepared, about what norms are acceptable, all influence curriculum, pedagogies, interactions, and students' sense of belonging, which is huge if you know the research with that. Second, many faculty conceptions reflect or reinforce white fragility, white savior narratives, willful ignorance, complacency, and so these are not just like faculty failings, they're embedded in institutional structures, cultures, reward systems, hiring, evaluations. And, you know, I identify as white faculty, and I studied so much of this just to go into this study, right? And it was very refining for me to see these different biases that I had or phrases that I'm intending to use as support actually perpetuating or perpetuating this bias and this problem. Um, Third, greater awareness is needed of how whiteness manifests, not just in overt discrimination, but in tacit norms, what counts as good writing, good speech, normal, right? Also in terms of implications, individual level, right? Professional development beyond the one-off, reflection opportunities to examine some of those assumptions. Institutional is definitely important. It's like the study's focus was faculty perceptions, but like without that structural change, nothing can actually change. So policy should promote faculty diversity, support multiple ways of knowing, elevate Latinx voices in leadership, align mission with structural supports. That's key because there isn't that usually. And when there is an accountability with it. Curricular pedagogical teaching should be culturally responsive, meaning leverage students' funds of knowledge, validate diverse backgrounds, and resist those deficit framings, which there a lot needs to go into that to even recognize it as a deficit framing. Intersectional consciousness. HSIs must recognize how race, ethnicity, class, gender, and other identities intersect, avoiding just flattening the identity, right? And so this is the last slide. So conclusions, you know, a lot went into that, but to kind of wrap it up, faculty perceptions at HSIs are shaped by interconnected themes of deficit thinking, power dynamics, complacency, and white savior narratives among faculty who are like really intending to do well, which reinforce one another, right? And so these beliefs and practices, they both reflect and perpetuate structural inequalities, which is key through the norms of whiteness, right? Whether it's in like the hierarchy, the teaching, evaluation, how resources are allocated, to name a few. And so the consequence, students are often positioned as lacking, right? And it's faculty's job to fix them. um, so, you know, it's great that there is high Latin enrollment, that there's a lot of HSI designations alone. Like that is a huge feat, but it's not sufficient to be any sort of arrival point, right? Especially at this point. What matters is how servingness is enacted, and that's key. And that's what this project really sought to look at on the ground structural level. Who's included, whose knowledge is valued, which norms are prevailing, because if we're actually wanting to serve students, not just enroll them, um like that needs to change. There needs to be accountability for that, right? And so lastly, to serve Latinx students, HSIs, they must be intentional to address unexamined whiteness, support faculty reflection, diversity, and redefine readiness, success, excellence to include what we talked about. And there must be the assumption that they already exist, right? No matter how well intended the faculty, the administration, the leaders, the mission statement genuinely is, these institutions, amongst others, were created for, maintaining power and structure and whiteness. Unless we radically change the structure, that's not going to really change just in a performative way. Um, yes. So that's I'm sorry. I think I went a little bit over.
You're okay. We have a few
Oh,
minutes left for questions. Thank you for all of that information. Yes, can we get some applause and hearts? I only have one question. So, Dr. Hamilton, Khan, I have a question about your collection methods. So, did you do these interviews yourself, or I may have missed it? So, please refresh my
yes,
memory if you did
I
it
did it
personally.
I did them myself. Yes.
Wow. Any
Yeah.
questions for Dr. Hamilton Khan? Yes, lots of applause, lots of applause. Very interesting information. Um, really interesting research around just really, what is equity, right? If you're not asking that question and you're in education and how do we go deeper in that? I really appreciate the balance of understanding the intention of the faculty members who were in your study, but also being able to see the actual outcomes, right? And what it takes to actually disrupt some of the perceptions that impact us in the classroom as educators. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now I do have your LinkedIn page here. Can I share that link, or where can people find you?
Yes, absolutely. You could share that. Yeah, definitely.
I'll pop that in the chat there. Definitely reach out to Dr. Hamilton Kahn if this type of research is interesting to you, if you want to hear more of her insights, connect with her as an academic. But lots of students in the room. I imagine some of you are studying in the College of Education here at Westcliff University. So please do reach out to her.
Yeah, thank you so much. I
Thank you.
appreciate that. And I will stay after and connect with the people reaching out to in the chat.